I'm going to kick off by asking another question which has been troubling me from marking A-level papers, which is that students are becoming confused because when they're writing about inflation, they're saying that the causes of inflation are cost-led because of COVID, because of the repercussions from COVID, and because of the repercussions of the Ukraine war. This is pushing up costs and creating cost push inflation, as we call it, in the A-level syllabus. And then they seem to think that the one thing that's being used to tackle that inflation is the interest rate. And when they start trying to match those two things up, it causes some difficulty. It causes some difficulty in my little brain as well. So I'd like to ask our guests whether they think that interest rates are the best way of tackling our current inflation.
The bodies that are responsible for delivering our economic policy. And obviously when it comes to inflation, we're talking about the Bank of England, whose job is to keep inflation within plus or minus 2%. And I think we can safely say that hasn't happened, and they've acknowledged that that's been a failure for them. So, Charles, I think your question was, is it all about costs? And I guess the line of questioning, we see the governor and people from the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England, we see them about 5 or 6 times a year to answer our questions. And the line of questioning that we've been following has been around not just the rising costs. So we saw a big rise in costs as we came out of the pandemic. I first started asking the governor about this really very early in 2021, because in my constituency, I was hearing from businesses that the price of cement was going up, the price of wood was going up, things were going up, you know, not a little, but like 95%. They were doubling in price, some of these things. And the governor was very dismissive. He said, this is a temporary uptick. This is a transitory increase in prices. There are a few bottlenecks in the supply chain. This will pass. But there were other things going on at the time, which I think, if you look in your economic textbooks and you write a chapter called How Do I Create Inflation?, it would have both this rising cost, but it would also have some other elements. It would have very low interest rates, which of course we did. The pandemic, the Bank of England lowered interest rates to 0.15, I think, or was it 0.1? And they were even talking at one point about how would they cope with negative interest rates. So that's another thing you would do if you wanted to create inflation. Another thing you would do if you wanted to create inflation would be that you'd loosen the amount of money circulating in the economy. And the bank did that as well at the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, they did so much loosening that it was, I think, almost as much as they'd done in the entire period from 2008. I mean, these are the textbook things that you would do to create inflation. And then on top of that, you have a further big shock to the economy, which was that in our British economy, which is so dependent on the price of gas, and we use oil, we had this invasion of Ukraine, which caused those prices to go up. And at the same time, you had a labour market, which had been very, very much kept strong during the pandemic period by this process of paying everyone's wages through furlough. And the Bank of England thought that when furlough came to the end at the end of 2021, they thought that perhaps the labour market would be suddenly very loose and that there'd be lots of people looking for jobs. And that did not happen at all. In fact, what we saw happening during furlough was that people not only were having furlough, but they were also probably working another job on top of that in an essential sector. And so the labour market was very, very tight when furlough came to the end of November. So there were really 4 things going on there, all of which were, in my opinion, a recipe for creating inflation. And we shouldn't be surprised that inflation has got out of its box. And in order to get inflation back into its box, the bank is going to have to sort of unwind all those things that it has control over, which are the amount of money, the level of interest rates, and of course they've got to use their network of agents to see that actually what are the labour market conditions, because what's happened is it's become now a second order effect, and it's become much more tricky to get rid of. So hope that's a pass answer, Charles, for your economic assessors.
Yeah. I basically agree with that. We had high inflation before Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine made it worse. And that was partly, I mean, certainly with hindsight, I think the furlough scheme went on for too long, though I think that was sort of forgivable. The Bank of England printed far too much money. I think that's less forgivable during the COVID period. But the point about interest rates is that they're there to get demand out of the economy. So yes, they can't help with the fact that gas prices have gone up. What they can do is essentially make us poorer, and that's what they're designed to do. And if they make us poorer, then that removes demand from the economy. Once that second round happens, once people's inflation goes up, people's wages rise, that drives inflation up. So you've got to find some way of stopping that. And the tool the Bank of England has is to increase interest rates. If you've got a mortgage, that has a big impact on your take-home, on your disposable income. Actually, if you own assets, it's having quite a big effect on the value of those assets. And we've lost, I can't remember, something like 70% of national income or something in terms of the household wealth over the last couple of years because interest rates have gone up. And that will have a slow effect on the behaviour of older and wealthier groups. So you're pushing it out that way. I do think it's a good question, though, as to whether, I mean, under the current sort of settlement, Harriett's absolutely right, it is the responsibility of the Bank of England to get inflation down, but they've only got one tool, which is interest rates or quantitative easing alongside it. Now, government behaviour is obviously important here as well. So if, for example, we would have a big tax cut at this moment, or a big increase in spending, then that would push inflation. So government has, at the very least, not to make things worse.
I think what Paul says is absolutely correct. I would add that I think the Bank of England has other tools on top of the two that have been mentioned. And one of the most important ones is actually their communication. Yes. And so they have a platform where when they raise rates, they can say what it is they're aiming to achieve. And I think it's been really interesting to see how Bank of England communication during this period, and bear in mind, this was happening not just in the UK, but around the world, how their communication differed from the communication from, say, the US Federal Reserve. So the US Federal Reserve made it very clear that they were starting a process of raising rates and that their job was to get inflation back under control, and that's what they would focus on. The Bank of England here, when they started to raise interest rates, they were almost apologetic that they were having to do it. And they kept using this word transitory. And they gave the market the impression initially that they weren't going to do very much on interest rates. And I think they should have been much clearer in their communication about the fact that their job is to keep inflation under control. And I think by being clearer earlier, they would have had to do less over time. So I think communication is another tool in their toolbox. And they've they've asked Dr. Ben Bernanke, the Nobel Prize-winning economist from the States, who was former head of the Federal Reserve in the States, they've asked him to do kind of a marking of their homework. So they're going through a really difficult A-level exam with Ben Bernanke marking it. And I think he's going to come out with a lot of comments about the way they communicated, because never underestimate the power of words in shaping financial expectations.
I certainly agree that getting inflation under control is really important. The three of us on this platform are just about old enough to remember the 1970s, which was not like 1930s Germany, but it was a period of inflation in double digits for quite some time, and really, really difficult from a societal point of view as well as an economic point of view, and the country really struggled over that period. So real focus on getting inflation down is absolutely important. But I think there is a kind of two things I'd add here. One is that one of the issues that the bank faces at the moment is that actually a much smaller fraction of, so what's the most direct effect of high increased interest rates? It's higher mortgages. Many fewer people have mortgages today than 30 years ago. The last time we really raised interest rates to get inflation under control was the early 1990s. Back then, about 45% of households had a mortgage. Today, about 30% of households have a mortgage. So the direct effect is on a much narrower group of people. Mostly, the big effects people, you won't think as young, but I think as young people in their early, mid-30s who have recently taken out a mortgage. So to the question, one of the sort of unfairnesses in a sense of this is that the cost of interest rates hits a particular group of the population. Now that's just kind of how interest rates work, but as I said earlier, it is also going to reduce asset prices for other people. The second thing it's worth saying is, I think one of the reasons that this cost of living crisis shock has hit so hard is that in previous situations when we've had a recession or when incomes have fallen, that's come off the back of periods when incomes have been rising. So if you think of the financial crisis back in 2008 to 2010, people's incomes fell, but they've been growing for sort of 20 years before that. If you think of the early 1990s, incomes on average have been growing through the 80s and so on. Recessions and cost of living crises tend to come off the back of periods of growth in incomes. We've had very little, if any, growth in incomes over the last 15, actually over the last 20 years or so. So earnings, average earnings, essentially the same today as they were in about 2006. Now that's literally never happened before, not since Napoleon anyway. Household incomes are very similar today once you take account of inflation to what they were in 2008. So this cost of living crisis has come off the back of a period of stagnation. Now, I should add, the UK is not on its own in that. Most countries have experienced something really quite similar since the financial crisis, a real slowdown in productivity, a real slowdown in incomes and wages. And that, I think, is why this period has hit so hard for so many people, and as Harriett said, particularly people on lower incomes.